want to thank you again for joining us for this study in the book of Isaiah. I'd ask that if you will, go ahead and be turning to Isaiah chapter 5 as we begin that study today. Hopefully we'll cover chapter 5. We have a couple of great chapters coming up, and we'll see how much time it takes. Chapter 6, of course, is the visionary call of Isaiah to prophesy. And then in chapter 7, verse 14, we have a verse that we'll probably be spending a great deal of time on, just simply because of the difficulty with fully understanding the passage as it relates to virgin birth and seeing other things about that. It's just a verse that I want to be sure and cover to a great deal in my belief that it is messianic, but dealing with all the issues that may come with that. And we'll make up some ground elsewhere where there's other times we'll cover a couple of chapters per session, but these next 3 chapters are chapters that are really going to take some study as it relates to some of the great issues that are involved. Chapter 5, in essence, is a parable, and it is the parable of the vineyard, or the song of the vineyard, as portrayed in these cases. And we'll break that down, looking at each aspect of that. It's interesting to see the number of times that parables have been so effective in the teaching of God's Word. Jesus used parables a great deal. We also have some powerful parables used in the Old Testament. For example, remember when David was confronted by Nathan, he told him the parable of that ewe lamb that was seen. And the essence of it is, it draws from language with which the audience is very familiar. And so therefore the application then is inescapable when you understand. For example, whenever Nathan told David, "You are the man," there was nowhere for David to go. He had already expressed the truth of the parable in saying that man deserved to die. And then he was understanding how guilty he was of what occurred or what happened with Uriah regarding Bathsheba. Well, the same thing is true here in this chapter. Vineyards were very important to this culture. Growing grapes in the Mediterranean area was a major crop for them in the ancient Near East. Vineyards were carefully cultivated. They were protected against vandalism. They were protected against wild beasts. The grape harvest and the treading out of the juice that was tied to that were occasions for festivals and to be celebrated. Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 33 talks about festival time as it related to the grapes. It occurred in the land of Israel 7 days prior to the Feast of Booths, which was a Thanksgiving holiday. You can read more about that in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 13. Vineyards were those things which were symbols of prosperity and being blessed as the inhabitants of that land. Hosea chapter 2 verse 15 in that context bears that out to greater detail. Well, Isaiah used these things as symbols in telling this parable about a lack of harvest and the result of a harvest that fell far short of expectations. And it's a parable that was told about Jerusalem and Judah and how their leaders had fallen down on what God had expected them to do, where God had expected them to be, due to their leadership at the time that these things were occurring. It had to do with God's relationship and where God was disappointed in them, and more than disappointed, we're going to see the wrath of God being promised because of this failure and because so much of these things were self-inflicted. It wasn't like an unexpected blight came upon the land. It wasn't like a herd, a bunch of locusts came through as normally happened and destroyed the crop. This crop failed because the leaders, the owners of the vineyard, as it relates to the parable, failed to do what God expected and demanded of them. In that sense, we're going to see the law of sowing and reaping come about and see that that is still very pertinent today as it relates to the understanding of a crop, but also of spirituality and where we need to be, what kind of examples we are, what kind of fruit that we're expected to bear. As we proceed through this parable, as it relates here to Judah, here in chapter 5, we're going to see, again, those expectations. We're going to see that God expected them to bear fruit. And because they didn't, then judgment was to come down upon them. Jesus used some of the same figures in the Old Testament. For example, in Matthew chapter 20 and verses 1 through 16, you've got the parable of the workers in a vineyard. There you might remember that different people were hired at different parts of the day to come and work in the vineyard. And at the end of the day, they got the price, the wages that was agreed upon. And you have those working all day expecting to get more, but in reality, they were paid what they had agreed upon. And so you find that example again of a vineyard and laborers and all that being a part of it. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 to 41, you have the parable of the wicked vine dressers. That's also repeated in Mark chapter 12 and Luke chapter 20. And then we move into John chapter 15, and there you have the lesson on the true vine. But all of these were clearly understood because of the prevalence of vineyards and grapes and harvests and benefit and all of those things that were part of that day. So this lesson can be entitled God's Disappointing Vineyard. I want you to imagine yourselves. We have some members here at Granbury Street who do wonderful gardens. And I've benefited myself from those gardens. And when these people plant those gardens, they have high expectations of the yield of the seeds that they plant. They care for it, they cultivate it, they water it, they do everything they can do, and they expect a good harvest. And they're going to be disappointed if it doesn't turn out like they wanted them to turn out. Let's keep that concept in mind. Their disappointment, and let's see it on a grander scale in God's disappointment regarding the crop that He expected from His vineyard. So let's look at verses 1 to 6 together. Now let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones and planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst and also made a wine press in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, please, between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please, let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. The words beloved and well-beloved are from the same Hebrew word, and forms of that word are used 40 times in the Song of Solomon to express intimate relationships. This is not a stranger that God is referring to here. These are His people. These are the people with whom God had forged and provided for a relationship, a covenant relationship with Him. He promised provisions in that relationship, and they had likewise promised their response to that covenant. And clearly they had fallen down on that. We've been talking about the fact that Judah is going to be carried away into Babylonian captivity beginning in 606, about 110 years from the time or so, 110 years or so that from the time that Isaiah wrote this book. And he indicated in this parable that it's hard work to prepare a vineyard. A farmer had to prepare the soil. He had to select the best plants or best vines to plant. He erected a tower to protect it, and he prepared a vat in anticipation of the harvest. The vat is where they would dump the grapes, and they would get inside, and they would stomp on the grapes, and the juice would flow out through vents, through holes prepared for that. And this is what the farmer, the owner of the vineyard, and in application, God had done. God had prepared for a great harvest. Yet in this parable, despite all of the effort that had been expended, it was a horrible crop. Instead of good, sweet grapes full of juice, it was wild grapes. It was a scrawny produce that was provided. Then in verses 3 through 6, we see that these are the very words of God himself. And in the parable, he was calling on Jerusalem to judge themselves. In other words, he was saying, take a look around yourselves. What more could I have done to make this a fruitful harvest? And the idea there is God had done everything he needed to do. So therefore, Jerusalem, Judah, needed to look at themselves and see that they were the cause of the unfruitful harvest, contrary to what God had provided. A question we could ask on a side note here is, what good is a vineyard that does not produce good fruit? What good is it to plant a fruit tree if it doesn't bear fruit? Fig tree is often seen in that. What good is it to plant any kind of seed if it's not going to produce fruit? As it related to these people who were directed by and lived under the law of Moses, they were expected to be better at this point. They were expected to be spending the effort to grow in their own faith through their responsibility, through their obligation, through their obedience to the law. But they were falling far short of what God had demanded of them. And in a sense, they didn't realize they were judging themselves. When you look at the nature of a parable, as this parable is being told, I'm sure people would be nodding their heads and saying, yes, yes. But in reality, they're judging themselves because they understand things the way they should be. And eventually they have to realize, wait a minute, we're not what God intended for us to be. And we're not what we professed we would be in our agreement to abide by the covenant that God had established. The vineyards would be neglected. They would become desolate because it did not fulfill the owner's rightful expectation. It produced no good fruit. God was not expecting too much here. He was not acting like a vineyard owner, a landowner who was treating people improperly. They deserved everything they were getting because of the expectations of the crop. Well, verse 7 indicates that this vineyard is Judah. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry for help. So there would be no misunderstanding, he now tells them exactly what he was talking about with this parable. You, Judah, are this vineyard. You, Judah, are responsible for the failure, your failure, to be what you should be. And especially, he's going to be zeroing in on the leaders of that community. Just as Hosea indicated that God's people were destroyed for lack of knowledge, he was focusing on the priest. The priest had failed to do what they should be doing. At this point, the leaders also should be helping these people along. This does not absolve the people of their wrong. If leadership takes us down a path that we are not to go, or does not take us down a path where we should go, we as a people should rise up and speak against that leadership. It is not God's leadership. Oh, we can make application of this in congregations today. We can't blame a preacher, we can't blame elders for a congregation that goes off the rails or fails what it should be doing, because the individual people have a higher standard, a higher leader, God and His Son, a higher standard, God's Word. And we need to be those who can maybe even help our leaders see where they're falling short there. Well, verses 8 through 23 now carry several woes. Remember, it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be taken away. It's going to become desolate. There's not going to be anything there but weeds. And God's not going to bring rain. In other words, Judah is not going to be blessed at all. Rather, there's going to be several sets of woes that we're going to look at as we move through. Look at verses 8 through 10. First of all, woe upon a covetous people. Woe to those who join house to house. They add field to field, till there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. In my hearing, the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah. The idea of covetousness here, the law provided for instruction as it regarded to people who were selling their land. When we look at this land, part of the land, when it was doled out to God's people, and they're taking the land under Joshua, that land was sold, but in the year of Jubilee, they would be returned. This land was to stay, in essence, with these people. But it was almost like these people were overlooking the year of Jubilee. They were ignoring the ownership of the people, and they were simply adding more and more to themselves and making it permanent when they took it upon themselves. In essence, they were ignoring God's law in Isaiah's time. Micah and Amos also warned people about their covetousness and land grabbing, and that's what's going on here. Micah chapter 2, verses 2 through 9, Amos chapter 2, verses 6 and 7 bear that out. So God, in verse 9, indicated He's revealing His will through the prophet. Because of their sin, they're going to lose their prized possessions. Again, remember, we're looking at captivity coming. And all but the poorest are going to be driven away, and then only a remnant are going to be brought back, only a small percentage. And it's a consequence of their sin. It would be easy to get an improper view of God here, that God is just looking down, waiting for an opportunity to blast His people. We're seeing that's not the case here. God had provided for their benefit. God, in His law, in His covenant, was taking care of these things, but they were casting that will aside and were ignoring what God had done. So the consequence of that, now God is no longer bound to His covenant. They had violated the covenant. They had broken those laws. And so therefore the consequences of their sin was self-inflicted, and it was also deserved because of their actions. Then in verses 11 through 17, he referred to woe to a debauching people. lustful, fleshful people. Let's read that section. The harp and the strings, the tambourine and flute and wine are in their feasts, but they do not regard the work of the Lord, nor consider the operation of his hands. Therefore my people have gone into captivity, because they have no knowledge. Their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged itself and opened its mouth beyond measure. Their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he who is jubilant shall descend into it. People shall be brought down, each man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment, and God who is holy shall be hallowed in righteousness. Then the lambs shall feed in their pasture, and in the waste places of the fat ones strangers shall eat. The pursuit of pleasure has been a problem that man has faced for thousands of years. Go way on back into the Old Testament to see this. And the pursuit of pleasure in and of itself is not wrong, as God has promised us certain things and the ability to be able to pursue those. But when you put that up on the top shelf to the exclusion of everything else, when you make that your goal, you have a problem. And that's what the wealthy had done. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die is an ethic that has developed over the years. And there are those who live by that same standard even today. I'm going to die one of these days, so I'm going to enjoy life to its fullest. And then people kick up their heels and move along. God indicated through Isaiah here that the root of the problem, though, was a lack of knowledge. People were not applying God's will. Whenever we leave God's will and we start venturing off into what we think, what our opinions, what our views are, and when those become the standard, we're in deep trouble because we've violated, we've neglected, we've rejected that, which was designed for our guidance and our provision. Isaiah had already noted this once back in chapter 1 and verse 3, and Hosea mentioned the same thing and tied again back to a problem with the leadership in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6. God wanted to be in a covenant relationship with them. That's what is so hard for people to see. Many people look to the quote-unquote God of the Old Testament as being a God of wrath and judgment and enjoyed inflicting punishment on people. That's not true. God was a God of grace. He was sending a prophet to them in the hopes that they would turn things around. They had over 100 years to do so, but they failed. And they carried off into captivity. We need to be able to teach the world today that God desires all men to be saved. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But brethren, he has to be sought. He's not going to inject himself into our lives, violating our free moral agency. Calvinism indicates that we can't deny God's goodness there, God's selection. And that's simply not true. God wants us, but we have to look for him. And we have to reach out and obey him. When you look at the problems that Isaiah described in these few verses, you see that it can only lead to ruin and ultimately to death. Sheol is spoken of there. And the concept of the end. Unless earthly accomplishments are done as to the Lord, then we're going to avail nothing in judgment. Verses 16 to 17 refers to the holiness of God. Holiness is seen in God's judgment and his righteousness. He is holy. Crooked living, falsehood, and all manner of sin had supplanted obedience to the law at this point. These Jews were guilty of the same issues as the Gentiles, as addressed by Paul in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. They had violated God's will, idolatry, homosexuality. All of those were symptoms of the rejection of God's will. They violated what God intended for human sexuality and imposed their own standard. And God gave them up to a debased mind. We read elsewhere. If that's the way man chooses to go, then God is going to allow man to go there. But then man cannot complain about the consequences that he's brought upon himself. Verses 18 and 19 deal with woe to an unbelieving people. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin as if with a cart rope, that say, let him make speed and hasten to his work that we may see it. And let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come, that we may know it. The attitude of Israel here is depicted as open defiance to God. This is just as true today as it was in Isaiah's day. People live in darkness because they have violated God's light. Verse 21 speaks of a woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. That reminds us of the words of Paul writing to the church at Rome in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. Not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought, wise in our own eyes. The enlightenment of today indicates that biblical things are foolishness. The Bible is for older people. The Bible is for ignorant people. The Bible is for people who need a crutch. Listen to what we have to say. We'll tell you how things really are. That's what scholarship says today, and many give heed to it. But we see a woe here pronounced on those who think of themselves more highly than they should. Verses 22 and 23, woe to a justice perverting people. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. Heroes and valiant men are terms that are normally used for brave warriors. These are those who have distinguished themselves in combat, proven themselves in the field. Here they're used sarcastically. The taking of a bribe was unjust, and it was something that was an abominable. It was an abomination to God. It perverted justice. Remember, even back in the law of Moses, it stated that judges were to judge righteously. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 19. And that was not what was characterizing the people of Isaiah's day. And then in verses 24 to 30, we've got about a minute and a half. Let's finish up this reading and make a few contexts as we bring this section to a close. Therefore, as the fire devours the stubble and the flame consumes the chaff, so their root will be as rottenness and their blossom will ascend like dust. Because they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, the anger of the Lord is aroused against his people. He has stretched out his hand against them and stricken them, and the hills trembled. Their carcasses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. For all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. He will lift up a banner to the nations from afar and will whistle to them from the end of the earth. Surely they shall come with speed swiftly. No one will be weary or stumble among them. No one will slumber or sleep, nor will the belt on their loins be loosed, nor the strap of their sandals be broken, whose arrows are sharp and all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves will seem like flint, and their wheels like a whirlwind. Their roaring will be like a lion. They will roar like young lions. Yes, they will roar and lay hold of the prey. They will carry it away safely, and no one will deliver. In that day they will roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold, darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened by the clouds. Just our time is about up. Let me make a couple of consequences. This is talking even more about the bitter consequences of their rejection. When you look at verses 24 through 30, it's talking largely about the captivity. It's going to be Babylon that's going to be spoken of. Babylon's going to be prepared. They're going to be fully equipped. They're going to be alert. They're going to be organized. And the land is going to fall under their feet. You see God's anger. You see conquest by these armies. You see them being portrayed as powerful. And you see the lion versus the prey. All of this brought upon themselves. And sadly, we're going to begin to see this fulfilled about the year 606 BC in that first wave of Babylonian captivity. Next week, Lord willing, we'll begin looking at the call of Isaiah as a prophet. Until then, God bless you.